Matthew chapter 7, starting to read at verse 24, and it's found on page 1056 in our Bible. The wise and foolish builders. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Well, the end of school has already been mentioned, and of course, towards the end of school year, there's often end-of-year tests and exams. Some people have had really big exams in previous weeks and are waiting on results that will come in a few weeks' time. Some people might have had more sort of in-house school end-of-year exams or whatever. And you find out, were the students really listening? Have they been actually taking it in all week? Well, as has already been mentioned this morning, we have been looking at what's commonly called the Sermon on the Mount. It's these chapters in the early part of Matthew's Gospel where Jesus is teaching some people up on a hillside 2,000 years ago. And we're just reaching the sort of climax or the culmination of what Jesus is saying. He's covered loads of topics, and we're getting now to the final point. And we'll discover, have people really been listening? Have people really taken it on board? Or we'll discover that that's an important thing for them to think about, but for us to think about as we've heard it. Now, if you're a visitor, you're just with us for the first time, or perhaps you're not even a Christian, you're just sort of checking out what do Christians do on a Sunday, what do Christians believe. Do listen in, because I hope it will be really helpful for you this morning, even if you've not been with us in previous weeks. I've been quite encouraged as I've looked at this week, because we discover that not everyone who's been listening to Jesus, as Jesus taught, has maybe really got it. Maybe it's not for everyone that the penny's really dropped as to what he's saying. And he's certainly warning about the danger of not having really taken on board and taken to heart what he's been saying. So if Jesus, who presumably is the best teacher ever, can have that outcome in people who are listening, then I've taken heart from that this week, that even though you're stuck with me, even if you'd had Jesus, there might have been some people here who if there were sort of final exams, maybe wouldn't get all A's. But anyway, but together, hopefully, as I share what I've found out as I've looked at this week, as you look at these verses as well, perhaps you've read them before coming, or as we look at them together, my prayer is that that God will help each one of us to see what he's particularly saying to us this morning. Now, to help us this morning, out three things I particularly want us to see. They come straight out of the passage, and you might be thinking, I could have come up with these, Peter. But there's two houses, but there's different outcomes here. There's two builders. There's a crucial difference between them. But then there's two surprises from what Jesus is teaching here. So let's look quickly at the first of those, which I think will be the shortest. There's two houses with different outcomes. This is somebody who's got like some sort of kit home, and they're trying to build it, I think, but it's has seen from above, it looks, I don't know if you've ever tried flat pack furniture and putting that together, but it looks, I don't know, I'm not sure if they're doing well or not. It's hard to tell from that picture, isn't it? But anyway, that's a builder building a house. I wonder how you get on if you had to build a house yourself. There's one or two people here who have to do it, but I think most of us would struggle. That's a great picture of somebody trying to build a house, but Jesus uses this brilliant word picture and conjures up this very striking idea of these two houses being built. In fact, this is one of the more famous things that Jesus says. It's certainly one of the more famous bits of the Sermon on the Mount, the idea of a house built on the rock and a house built on the sand. Notice both the builders want to be in a house. They both think that a house is good. It isn't one of them's building a tent and one of them's building a house. They both want a house. And both of them presumably work hard because, they're building a whole house. That's quite hard work. Except for one of them, it's perhaps a little bit quicker than for the other one. In Luke's Gospel, in chapter 6, where he gives us the equivalent story, it mentions there that one of them is digging down, whereas presumably the other one isn't. So you can imagine if they were nearby, these houses, which we're not told is the case, but if they were nearby, one would seem like it was going up more quickly than the other one. One would appear perhaps to be cheaper to construct. If it takes longer, there's more work involved, that's going to be a more costly project, isn't it? One might seem like it's a lot less faff than the other one. All this digging down, trying to break granite or whatever stone you encounter as you dig down. If these people were building their houses on their own, there might be one of them that's going to bed a bit tireder at the end of the day. He's been trying to break rocks. The other one's just sort of started with a nice smooth bit of sand, started building. It's just less hard work, isn't it? Perhaps one of them would look at the other and say, oh, you're so old-fashioned using these old methods people used to use where they dug down, they broke rocks. Why don't you get with the modern way of doing it? Just put it on top of the sand. One is spending time underground, where the other one appears to be shooting ahead and heading upwards. Far less trouble just to start at ground level. Why bother digging down? And to an untrained eye, when these two houses are complete, they might have looked extraordinarily similar to an untrained eye, because it's only beneath the surface that the difference is found, isn't it? But if we look at verse 25, where we're told about one of the houses, and verse 27, where we're told about the other, in both cases, a storm comes. A storm comes. And the outcome is totally different. One doesn't fall, and one falls with a great crash. That signals a catastrophic failure, doesn't it? Not a few bits dropped off. A great crash. The whole thing totally falls down. Well, it's a great story. It's a memorable story. It's something that people have been struck by over many years. But it's a story with a meaning. So let's move on and explore that. So that was my first thing, that there's two houses. But more importantly, there's two builders. And there's a crucial difference between them. I'm not sure about the health and safety of this. Look at this picture. Look at what's going on there. I'm not sure. Should they have some sort of harness or scaffold or something? I don't know. Anyway, maybe it's in a part of the world where they don't worry about that sort of thing. Holland, in my experience. Much more relaxed. Anyway, but so we've got the two houses, but it's really a story about two builders. And just like the houses could seem similar, the builders could seem similar. They both want a house, they're both working at it. But there is a crucial difference. And we've already seen the difference in the outcome. But it's why there's that outcome, or why Jesus says that these people are like somebody who's building a house in this way. And it's not perhaps what we might at first think. Now, perhaps like me, you have heard something along these lines. Jesus is a great rock, a solid foundation to build your life upon. In fact, it would be foolish to build your life on sand. What's sand in this instance? Well, it's anything that isn't Jesus. Jesus is a great rock, a solid foundation. Build your life on him. Try and build your life on anything else or anyone else, and the Bible says that's foolish. And a Bible verse like 1 Corinthians 3:11 would be a great support for that. So here's 1 Corinthians 3, 10 and 11. Each one of you should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. And that whole section, we haven't got time to read it, but it talks about different things you might build your life upon: gold and treasure. You might try and have that as the foundation of your life. But it's saying that the foundation that you really want is Jesus. So this idea that Jesus is a rock upon which we can build our life, anything else is like sand. Well, it's a correct idea. The Bible does tell us about that as an idea. But in this story that Jesus tells, if we think about it in that way, we might think of these two builders as being a Christian person and a non-Christian person. So, those of us who are here this morning in this building, listening to what Jesus said, would think, well, of course we're building on the rock, aren't we? Because we're here, we're listening to what Jesus said. But it's the folk out there who are not here this morning, well, they're building on sand, aren't they? They're not building on Jesus. They're not here this morning listening to what Jesus said. But if we look carefully at verse 24, it says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man. Or verse 26, but anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man. Do you notice the crucial thing there? They both hear Jesus' words. So it's not the people who are here this morning versus people who aren't here this morning to hear Jesus' words. Jesus wanted to say this to us who are hearing his word this morning. So among us could be wise folk and foolish folk. So don't think of yourself automatically as wise because you're here listening to this, and the fools are all out there who aren't listening. Jesus says it's actually both people hear Jesus' words. So what's the difference? Well, the wise person hears and puts it into practice, verse 24. The fool, verse 26, hears, doesn't do it. They don't do it. They hear it, but they don't put it into practice. So the difference is obedience and disobedience. Obedience being building on the rock, disobedience building on the sand. Now, one way of thinking about that is people who are genuinely Christian and people who aren't. But I didn't want us to start immediately putting ourselves into a certain category, because I think Jesus is speaking to the people who are listening to him and saying, be careful how you listen, but among the people who listen, do you actually put it into practice? Do you obey? So rather than Jesus' words making us to feel smug that we're sitting here in church this morning rather than being out at a sports club or at a car boot sale or, any amount of Sunday morning activities. I once was at a meeting where they said, we should put this on Sunday morning because nobody has anything on a Sunday morning. I was thinking, that's interesting that in our society that's now what people think. So lots of things get put on Sunday morning. So rather than us feeling smug, we're in church listening to God's word, and all these fools are out there doing these other things. Jesus' words should actually have us squirming in our seat a little bit. But if you've been here recent weeks, you should know that that's no surprise, because the whole Sermon on the Mount has had us squirming in our seats a little bit. Because Jesus often comes at things in a slightly different way to how we might expect. He sometimes ratchets things up. You've heard it said this, but I'm saying this. And we've seen that time and time again as we've gone through the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's no surprise that here at the climax of what he's saying, it's something similar. Do you remember at the start I talked about students who are having exams or end-of-year tests or whatever? It's revealing what they know. Well, here at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he's really saying, you've been listening, but have you taken it in? You've been listening, but are you going to put it into practice? Because there can be two types of hearers. It's not those who heard and those who weren't here. Two types of hearers. So, it's worth remembering, and we saw this again last week, that back at the very start of the Sermon on the Mount, so that's chapter 5, verse 1, where it talks about the fact that he's on a hillside, he gathers his disciples to him, but it's not a secret teaching session for the inner circle. The crowd are listening in. And verse 28, right at the end of our section, reminds us of that. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching. There's not just his inner circle, there's a whole crowd listening. Well, what do we make of this challenge? Well, if we think about what the whole of the New Testament is saying, not simply Matthew's Gospel, then perhaps what Jesus is saying here doesn't come as a surprise to us. We find similar things elsewhere. James 1:22, for example, I think I've got it on the screen for us, says this: "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." Do what it says. And the word there is talking about God's word. But interestingly, the word is also one of the many sort of code names for Jesus, isn't it? It's one of the descriptions of Jesus. God speaks to us through Jesus. Don't merely listen to the word, or we could say to Jesus, and so deceive ourselves. We think, I'm here, I'm listening. We've got to do it. We'd be deceiving ourselves if we think we can just listen. We just fill ourselves with knowledge and not put any of it into practice. So, the New Testament is saying this in various ways. Here Jesus is saying it in a very striking way. And we've had challenge after challenge in the Sermon on the Mount. But here, in almost like a final twist of the knife, if I can say that in a reverent way, in a final sort of putting us on the spot, putting his hearers on the spot, Jesus says, yeah, you've been listening, but are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Well, so we've got these two builders, or two hearers, and this crucial difference between them. One's doing what he, putting into practice what he hears, and one is not. Let's move on to the third and final thing I want us to see. And this is two surprises here. And then the first surprise is that Jesus appears to be teaching salvation by works. He's just laid out all these things that you must do. And we might think he's just given us a massive checklist of how to be a Christian. And that seems to stand at odds with other things that the New Testament says. So take, for example, Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. Again, I've got it on the screen for us. For it is by grace, that's God's undeserved favour, a gift from him. It's by grace you've been saved through faith in Jesus. And this not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works. Not by works, so that no one can boast. And yet here we've had Jesus just laying out this massive list of things, and he's saying, it's not just knowing this list or hearing these things, you've got to do them. You've got to do them. So how do we understand this? Well, Ephesians 2 doesn't end there, and you'll see the next bit on the screen. It's not by works so that no one can boast. However, verse 10 continues, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You see, the two things are totally compatible. We're saved by grace alone, as the New Testament is very clear on, but a changed life leads to changed deeds, changed actions, changed attitudes, changed behavior. We're created to do good works. It's how we show the family likeness, that we're part of God's family. It's how we show that we're like Him. Now, I did search for a picture of a family likeness, and boy, does the internet turn up a load of cute pictures of families. Here's one where the kids have a likeness to both the father and mother. I know you can't see the father really clearly there, but they're a lovely blend of both. And you often see that, don't you, within families, that children look a bit like both sides of the family. You might have heard me say before that when our kids were young and we used to visit Lucy's family in Kendal and my family in Keswick, on the drive between Kendal and Keswick, our kids changed from looking quite a lot like Lucy's family to looking quite a lot like my family. So in Lucy's family, they look like relatives on their side. But by the time we got to Keswick, my family would say, oh, they look a bit like Auntie Sheila. Or whatever, do you know what I mean? And it's just because that's who people are familiar with. But they're a lovely blend of both families, and that can be a lovely thing. But for us, we want to show the family likeness that we're part of God's family. And as the Holy Spirit gets to work on us, changing us from the inside out, we start to show the family likeness. It reveals the genuineness of what's going on inside. The fact that it's coming out, it's sort of leaking out. We almost can't help it, perhaps, as God changes us. Remember our houses? I said that superficially they might look very similar. The difference is all in the unseen part. The difference is what's going on beneath the surface. And so it can be with a Christian. So we could all be here listening. We could even say some of the right things because we're saying back what we've heard that God says. But I think Jesus is pointing out that it's a changed life that reveals what's really going on behind the scenes. Yesterday, my cousin invited me to go with him to a motor racing circuit where his son was taking part in a race. They weren't racing these cars, they were racing more like a road car, but at the same on the same day, one of the other races that was happening were these cars. Now, I wonder if anyone can work out what type of car this race series is for. Anyone reckon they recognise the car there?
VW Beetle.
VW Beetle. Look at them all those VW Beetles. Do you know what? Would you be surprised to know that every single one of those cars has not a single part of a VW Beetle in their makeup? So can we have the next slide? So they actually are this with a fiberglass shell that looks like a VW Beetle plonked on top. So they look like a Beetle. They don't have a single part that comes from a VW Beetle because they're really slow. Having owned one, they're really slow. You wouldn't want to race in a Beetle. But and the handling's not brilliant. But these things are just made to look, because it's a car that people often feel fondly about, they look like a Beetle. What's my point? Is it superficially looks like one thing, it's a totally different thing. When you lift off the fiberglass body, it's a totally different thing. And sometimes people can be like that, can't they? We might say we're one thing. We might turn up here on Sunday and appear like we're one thing. But Jesus is pointing out that it's what's going on inside or beneath the surface, in the case of the houses, with the foundations. That's where actually, whether or not it can stand a storm will be revealed. So I think our first surprise, is Jesus' teaching works? No, he's not, but he's saying that the fruit that comes out from trusting Jesus, from knowing he died to pay a price for our sin on that cross, from knowing what it is to have our sins forgiven, to come to him in repentance and faith, that is worked out, or the evidence of that is in whether or not we listen to what he says and put it into practice. I've got a second surprise, though, for us. And it's that Jesus doesn't say what people expect. So when we get to verse 28 and 29 at the very end of our section, we've already touched on this, that the crowd are amazed by his teaching. This comes several times in Matthew's Gospel, that the crowd are amazed by Jesus' teaching. What are they amazed about? Well, I think the content of it, but particularly, he taught as one who had authority, not as teachers of the law. They're amazed. Now, he taught as one who had authority. There's a few ways we could understand that. It could mean he was just really loud. He was just a very forceful personality. He really rammed home his point. He was banging on the table or whatever. But everything else we know about Jesus from the Gospels does not lead us to think that Jesus was teaching in that way. Although Jesus could be stern and had hard words for people when he needed to have, I think in this setting we'd expect Jesus to be speaking with compassion and gentleness, but the content of what he's saying, I think, is what they're getting at. He's not just quoting other people's ideas, as rabbis, even to this day, but in Jesus' day, did, referring to various other rabbis that have said things in the past, and Rabbi so-and-so, understood this in this way, but this guy said this, and this guy said this. Jesus cut through all that and said, but I'm saying to you this. And he had authority. And not only that, he's original. I've already mentioned he ratchets up various things. So earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's been talking about what they understood from the Old Testament, he says, you've heard this, but let me just really sharpen that for you. And it is hard. It is a difficult way to walk. And that's why I found this picture. I've never seen that picture out on a walk, but it's a bit depressing, isn't it? It's like, I'm not sure I want to continue on this walk. These people are hobbling. Look at them, they're bent over. It's really fast. And this walking is difficult. But to walk the talk, so to take what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and he's just said, it's not just hearing it, it's doing it, that's really difficult. It's really difficult. You look at what he says, and you think, who can do this? And if you've been here over the weeks, you've thought, we've seen that time and time again. Goodness me, this is really challenging stuff. Occasionally, because I'm a church minister, I meet people who will say, well, I don't come to church, and they don't say this, but and stop trying to persuade me to come, because I'm not coming to your church. But I don't come to church, but I am a Christian. Don't feel I need to go to church, but I try and live by the Ten Commandments, or less usually, somebody might say, I try and live by the Sermon on the Mount. I think knowledge of it is disappearing fast in our society. So I think it's really an older generation that might have said that in the past. I think that would be much less common now. People may like the idea of Jesus' teaching, the idea of the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, or the idea of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, but they don't like the idea of church or formalised religion, people might say. We're asking people what their favourite bit is of either what's your favourite of the Ten Commandments, or what's your favourite bit of the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think many could come up with a really compelling answer. But almost certainly somebody in that scenario is not going to say the bit we just looked at last week. Just look back to chapter 7, verse 22 and 23, where Jesus says, "Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you, away from me, you evildoers." So a lot of people who are doing stuff, as we saw last week, really scary verses. So I don't think many people would be choosing those as their favourites. I don't think many of us probably would be. Or there might not be many people choosing chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus had said, and we looked at this quite some time ago, but Jesus said, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And those guys were experts at keeping rules. Goodness me. Unless your righteousness surpasses them. And here he's saying, you've got to hear this stuff and do it. And it's really difficult. This is a difficult path to walk. So no wonder they're amazed at his teaching. Who can do this? It's a bit like when he talks about camels getting through the eye of a needle or whatever. Who can possibly do that? Jesus, aren't you setting the bar just too high? Who can do this? People might be surprised how radical this standard is. And it is actually impossible. It is actually impossible without his help. And if the message of the New Testament was, keep these things, and then you can be acceptable to God, not one of us would be able to do it. Not one of us would be able to do it. In fact, Jesus Christ is the only person who ever was able to completely live this way. But brilliantly, as we've already been reminded, that is not the message of the New Testament. The message of the New Testament is that God, by grace, offers us a free gift of forgiveness for sin. He offers us his Spirit at work within us, helping us chuck out the trash that's in our heart and helping us to be reshaped, sort of rewired from the inside out to be able to live this way. It's a lifelong process, but God's at work to help us to do that. It's a sign of genuine faith. And whether we're building on sand or rock is revealed by how much we're allowing that process to happen. Well, just as we close, our time is gone, but just as we close, I was reading this week a sermon from 1870, preached on this very section by the Victorian preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon, who in 1870 at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London preached on this passage. And there was one section of what he said that really stood out and I really noticed. He said, one builder is wise, the other is foolish. One superficial, the other substantial. One pretentious, is pretending, the other sincere. The wise man's work was honest work, where men's eyes could not judge it. The other's work was only well made above ground. There was nothing of reality in the hidden parts. There was nothing of reality in the hidden parts. Here Jesus challenged to us as we conclude the Sermon on the Mount, don't be somebody who just hears and doesn't do. It's actually dangerous. It's actually dangerous. When the storms come, there's nothing of substance to help you. Let's pray. Father, none of us want to be foolish, we want to be wise. That's true generally in life. But as we hear Jesus' call, we understand how big it is. How impossible actually it would be if we do it in our own strength. So we ask for your help. Help us to be wise. Help us to be hearers and doers. Help us to put these things into practice. Father, we pray that as we reflect perhaps back on these 3 chapters of Matthew, perhaps there's particular things you want us to notice or be reminded of, particular things to reflect on, maybe a particular thing where we need to be a hearer and doer. Father, we want to be people who do honest work, who are wise builders, who are building something of substance in our lives, who are sincere, who aren't just doing things that humans can see, but are doing things that you would enable you to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Father, I pray that you'd help us to do that. Amen.